In piedi!
Toruzzo, come va? Come va?
Bene,
Signori, mi auguro voi apprezziate la novità d'essere riuniti qui tutti insieme. All'americana!
Ragazzi, qui si smonta tutto. Il film non si fa più. 2 giorni qua non ci deve essere più niente. Bisogna cominciare subito. Coraggio, al lavoro, buttate giù. Dico bene, autore?
Sì, grazie. Arrivederci, ragazzi. Ci vediamo in un prossimo film.
Lo speriamo.
Ciao, marinai.
Welcome to Cinema Italia, a podcast dedicated to the world of Italian cinema. Presented by me, John Bleasdale. Everybody to Cinema Italia. My name is John Bleasdale, and I am joined by James Peaty, the brilliant comic book writer of many fascinating. What have you been writing recently, James?
What have I been writing recently? I've actually been writing some theatre, which is a bit of a new thing for me. But I've just finished for 2008. Last year, I finished the series Skip Tracer, which I did 7 books of, which was quite a long. The lockdown years would be most of that, I think, actually. Certainly the second half. Did another series for them I just finished around the same time called Diamond Dogs. Those were my lockdown projects. I'm doing a few I've been doing a few short things for 2000 recently. A series called Bladers, which has been in the blog recently. And something else. What did I do? Another thing called Scooter and Jinx. But I used to do Doctor Who for Titan Comics, done various things for DC and Marvel in the past, so that's my main thing. But yeah, I've made films and written films in the past. The last short film I made was a couple of years ago, actually. But I've been during lockdown. I started joined a sort of theatre group, writers group, and I've got a short play that's on in at the Southwark Playhouse in a few weeks, which is part of a kind of even a showcase thing. But that's really interesting. I haven't really ever done that before, so not since I was at school. So it's that's been a kind of interesting thing to be working with actors again in that kind of environment. It's very, very interesting.
Oh yeah, I've got a very romantic notion of the theatre from my sort of university theatre days. But there's no better atmosphere. There's no better place to be in terms of excitement and everything than sort of behind the scenes of a theatrical production, I think.
Well, I haven't done it at university. I did it at GCSE.
Right.
But I was in a school play when it's now just reopened in the West End, isn't it? Guys and Dolls. But I was in a big school production of Guys and Dolls when I was about 15. And that was kind of a bit of I guess that was a bit life-changing because I was in the production, the kind of company, the rehearsals, and I was doing sort of GCSE drama at the time. And that's really where I first started writing. I wrote plays. I was like 15, 16 for us to do as part of our assessments. It kind of morphed into something else as I got a bit older. I didn't do drama or theatre studies when I went to do my A-levels, but more towards film, which was obviously what I was kind of was more interested in. But coming back around to it again now, older, it's interesting. That's where it starts. But I guess that's where it all starts for most people because it's putting on a play is much cheaper as well.
Right, absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and
very pure as well. You got that very pure connection with your audience, and it's interesting doing things with or writing comics. You've got that kind of barrier between you and an audience, and it's filtered through the artist as well. And you don't really have. I mean, the internet's changed things a bit, but there's not a huge amount of feedback with the audience. And when you do make short films, or whatever, unless you get them in a festival and you're at that screening, you get kind of feedback from really how that plays with an audience. But when you're doing a theatrical piece, you're there and you can see whether it works or it doesn't work. And, so I had a piece played a couple of weeks ago on a Monday night sort of thing, showcase, rehearsed reading, which was great. It played really, really well. It was a really great experience, but you never get that kind of visceral hit. And I think once you get that kind of hit, you kind of want a bit more of it because we're all so vain and
Yeah,
And
but
validation in that way. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing now.
what's the name of the play?
The piece I've got playing in a couple of weeks is called Mother Knows Best. It's a very short thing. It's only sort of 5 minute little piece. It's two-hander. But as it's by me, there's kind of the character, the words Counselor Troy and Batman are mentioned in it. You know, there's a kind of pop cultural kind of component to it, and the words Marty Pello as well. Bradley Walsh and I think who's the other one? Nicky Campbell is also mentioned. So it has a kind of it's very rooted.
That's your 5 minutes up, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, the whole worlds are contained in those words. Yeah, it's So yeah, that's what it is. So Mother Knows Best. It's on at Southwark Playhouse as part of Art from the Heart, which is run by Directors Cut Theatre Company, which is I think it's the 30th of April in the evening.
Right.
If you're in, for some reason, go there.
Yeah, well, there you go. Give it a bit of a plug. Although I'm not entirely sure when we'll be publishing this podcast, so that might have already happened.
If it's already happened, it was a wonderful evening. That's all I was saying.
Everybody enjoyed it. It.
Absolutely.
And the connection with your chosen film, Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion, or to give it the Italian title, Indagine su un cittadino al di sopra di ogni sospetto. These wonderful long titles that Italian films of the 70s had are really good. This is a film from 1970, directed by Elio Petri and starring Gian Maria Volonté, who, to go back to the theatrical connection just briefly, broke through first in the theatre. He was in the first Italian production of Samuel Beckett's Krapp's Last Tape.
Oh, right.
And he's and I think he did Shakespeare, and he's kind of coming out of that quite classically trained tradition of Italian theatre actors. But probably best known to you and me, the likes of us, as the villain in Fistful of Dollars and a different villain in For a Few Dollars More. Yeah. I don't know. I imagine you're probably similar in that I assumed he was Mexican in watching those films.
Well, you never know, do you? I mean, interesting watching this. I can see this. I didn't know about his theatrical career. He's got a bit of a Olivier about his face as well, especially in this, especially with the shorter hair.
Yes,
something about Larry, especially when you see Olivier in things like I don't know, Spartacus. You know that period as well. Maybe it's haircuts, maybe it's something. But he's got something of the Olivier in his face that maybe isn't there in the not apparent in the Leone films.
Yeah. I think you're right. There's something very much. There's a sort of flat. There's something about his mouth, and there's something sort of cruel in his face, which I'm absolutely positive is the performance rather than the physical sort of makeup. But it's more than a passing resemblance to Olivier. That's and I think in terms of nationally how he's considered as an actor in Italy, I think he would be among the Oliviers.
Interesting.
Just in terms of there's Volonté, there's Mastroianni, and I think I would probably suggest those two were the leading serious dramatic actors of Italian cinema.
Right. I guess. Well, and also I guess Mr. Antonioni is the most internationally known, probably, isn't he? I guess.
Yeah, that's why I'm really specifying in Italy, because I think outside of Italy, Mastroianni is absolutely famous and is iconic image of Italy, whereas Volonté is the guy Clint Eastwood shot. Right. Beyond, say, cinephiles or people with a particular interest, which is unfortunate, because I think he's got a stunning run of films, of which this is perhaps one of his best performances. Where did you first come across this film?
Where did I first come across it? I first came across it, I'm trying to think how long ago it would have been. I'll say around 10 years ago, when I was making my first short, particularly my second short, actually. So this was probably it would have been about 2013, so around the time my daughter was born. I was working with, on my first three films. I did three films with an Italian editor,
Right.
Alessandro Inglimia. And Alessandro had studied film in Italy at university, and he studied with, I'm not going to say that he studied with the editor of this, but he studied with someone who was, I cannot remember, but top guy in Italian cinema. And obviously, because of that, he had obviously gone a deep dive into Italian cinema history. And I'd written we were working on a cut of a short. It was my second short, was Appraisal. And have written a feature version of that. It could have maybe got made at some point around about 2016, but we were talking about it then because we were cutting this other scene, and he was saying, "Oh, you should see this. It reminds me of this, the screenplay." I was like, "What's this?" So he kind of gave me a DVD copy of the film with subtitles, which I watched then, and it was like, while it's not the same it's not the same story, I can see what he meant. There's a lot of similar kind of tone and feel, and the kind of politics, I guess. There's the way this film's structured, with the way the flashbacks are kind of woven in, but you're never quite sure if they're real or imagined. And there's a kind of, that kind of elusive quality to it. So yeah, I think that, and I think also as well that the lead character is there's a little bit of kind of resonance there. So Alessandro sent that my way, and I watched it from there, and it's like, you think, well, wow, this is a serious piece of work that is completely invisible within the kind of broader kind of cinematic culture. And yet, I think if you look at it, it's clearly been very influential. I mean, I think Ali and I were talking about, the Sorrentino film, The Consequences of Love. I think, while that's not the same kind of film, there's something of that there's something of this in that, I think, definitely.
And even Il Divo as well, the Sorrentino sort of political, I think it's his follow-up to Consequences of Love, is definitely feels like it's influenced widely by Elio Petri's work. Yeah,
and also I think when you look at it, you then say, well, this has to be an influence on stuff like Bad Lieutenant, and also on even something like The Departed as well. When Scorsese did that, I know it's a remake of Infernal Affairs, but I'd say there's more of this in that than Infernal Affairs. I was thinking of the bit in Departed where he's looking at where he's got the apartment overlooking the church and all that. So that there's an element of that, I think, that's very strong in it. And also the difference there between, Ferrara and Scorsese, it's Italian Americans as opposed to Italians. Their thing is that the church in a way is kind of more is the thing, isn't it? And redemption, the badness and redemption. And, there's a kind of Hollywood element to that as well, as dark as those films are. Whereas, although I'd say The Departed is obviously more nihilistic, be some of the others. Whereas here you've got, that's not really, the clerical thing is not really there, but it's about, you're in that sort of, there's a lot less romanticism about these structures of power in Italian cinema and Italian culture, full stop. So I think there's a difference. The emigre and the kind of like the sort of indigenous sort of experience are very different. And the way obviously it thinks about power and politics and everything else is, those were the things that really struck me when I saw it. Is it resonates with Sorrentino's work, but I think also with Ferrara and Scorsese. Obviously, I don't think I've ever heard Scorsese or Ferrara talk about it, but
yeah, that'd be interesting to look up, actually, because I absolutely agree with you about both of those. Although I hadn't really thought of The Departed, but absolutely. I think that's a really good call. Interestingly, the fact that you sort of came in this while you were via an editor, the editor of the film, Ruggero Mastroianni, is actually brother to the actor.
Marcello.
Yeah, and so he's actually one of the most sort of famous and credited editors of this period. So yeah, And he looks quite similar to his brother as well. So that's quite one of those Attenborough-like families where everyone sits around lunch going, "What are you doing this week?"
This darling, yes. The dish of the edit suite, whereas most editors are kind of like sort of hunched over. And to be fair, Alessandro was not like that. But yeah, but it's a small world, isn't it? And it's small, and that culture. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about Italian cinema of this kind of from the 60s onwards is there's a lot of cross-pollination, isn't there? Whether that's Leone, whether that's Argento, whether that's all these different. I mean, it made me think of that as well. I mean, what struck me, there's consequences of love. These are the obvious ones, but also you have to look at it and see. I think there's a big connection to Salo in there, and I'd say there's a strong connection to. Well, that's the one that really sort of struck me actually.
Well, actually, you mentioning Argento, I think, would be in a way it does connect to more genre cinema of the gialli and what we call the polizieschi as well, the sort of police procedurals.
Well, yeah, you're right. I think there was in terms of Italian cinema, it definitely. There's an element of like the bird with the crystal plumage, because I think that's made around the same sort of time, isn't it? There's before Argento goes full kind of, operatic in his style, there's kind of still some sort of one foot in reality to some degree. But also there's you talk about the Italian, the police films, but also the French ones. So if you think of like Melville, I was thinking it's interesting the parallel and differences between what, say, Melville was doing in like the Cercle Rouge and stuff like that. Roughly around the same sort of time, mid 60s, early 70s period. And this type of film, the Italian flavor and the French flavor is very different. The Italian flavor, this is far more kind of lurid and sweaty, and it's kind of like it's earthy. It's very tactile, whereas the French stuff is much more kind of removed and remote, and looks better on a poster in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, Volonté, of course, was in the Cercle Rouge as well. So there's a sort of European crossover as well as an Italian crossover, as you were saying. Let's talk a little bit about the story, and I think it's safe to say we're going to sort of spoil the film. So if you care about that sort of thing, you might want to watch the film first. But to tell you the truth, I don't think this is a fairly spoiler-proof film. It's not like you have any real twists. It's a bit like Columbo. You know who did the murder.
Well, it was very like Columbo. The plot is completely not the point of the film, and it's like the plot is kind of played up front in the first sort of 3-4 minutes, isn't it? I mean, that's it. In fact, the first 10 minutes is the film in a way. And then how it plays out from there is a totally different thing. Yeah. So
just to give a brief sort of synopsis of the story, a character who we don't actually, I don't think we ever get a name. I think he's just always referred to as Il Dottore, which is Dottore is in Italy is used very promiscuously to anyone who basically has a degree. Can call themselves dottore. So it's an honorific, but you can be an architect and you can be a dottore, you can be a policeman or lawyer and you can be dottore. So it's not it's not as if it's being used in some sort of ironic way or anything like that. That's perfectly. But anyway, that's how he's kind of named in his official thing. He played by Volonté. We see him at the very beginning murder his lover, Augusta Terzi, who's played by the Brazilian sort of supermodel Florinda Balkan. This happens sort of. I was interested rewatching this when you suggested watching this, James. That it happens on the eve of his promotion. So in a way, it takes that cliche of one last case and sort of flips it a little bit, because it is kind of his last case, but he's not going to be on it because the next day he is taking up his new position, which is as a head of a sort of political department.
Well, he's the head of homicide, isn't he? That's basically what he is, and then he commits murder for reasons that we sort of unfold And even then, you kind of have to make it's never kind of completely. He does kind of sort of say, but even then, there's an element of ambiguity to it, isn't there? It's like, yeah, he's going from strict criminal investigation to political investigation, isn't he?
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, as you said, he's head of homicide, and then he hands that over, and he becomes the head of a new political sort of crimes unit, which is seen as much more powerful. So he's definitely on his way up the various, and he has a sort of he has a political patron, I guess you would say, who is who he immediately sort of goes and says, "Oh, I had an affair with this murder victim," and the guy goes, "Oh, what was she like in bed?" That's his first sort of question. And throughout the rest of the film, he increasingly sort of puts himself in the way of the investigation in terms of leaving clues, making witnesses show up and things like that, interrogating witnesses himself in a way that seems bafflingly self-destructive. And yet also there are a series of flashbacks which, as you say, sort of to some degree not justify, but give the motivation and the for his crimes. But I also agree with you that motivation isn't necessarily sort of completely explanatory. There are various things there, but I'm not sure how much it's a little bit like Iago in Othello. Do we trust what he tells us for why he does what he does?
Well, it's the whole thing. It's the fallible narrator idea, isn't it? As well, we've seen so many people do this. I mean, Christopher Nolan's made a career out of it. It's like there's a little bit of like following, I think, in it as well. Actually, this is a similar kind of the complicity and the kind of, because it's super noir. I mean, you take the political out of it, and I mean, and obviously it's the cinema of ideas that's really kind of popular in the 60s, early 70s, particularly Italian cinema. But you take that away from it, and it doesn't look like a noir, but it's very noir in the way that it's very. The other film that it reminded me of is The Offense.
Yeah, that's a good call. Yeah, Sidney Lumet. And
Sean Connery and Ian Bannon, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that is the closest thing I can think of to a film that's similar in that it has a kind of there's a sort of theatrical element to it, but it's about ideas. But there's no such thing really in that film, and in this film as a good guy. There is no such kind of. Nothing is as cut and dried as that.
Absolutely, there are victims, and but even the victims seem to some degree be putting themselves in the way of danger. The noir idea is really good, even though it's almost like they flip the negative at some point, because he throughout the film wears this sort of white suit.
Yes.
Which again, who goes and commits a murder with a razor blade?
Yeah. Well, he tells her he's going to do it as well.
Absolutely.
He says, "I'm going to cut your throat," in like the third minute of the film.
Yeah.
And then he does it.
Yeah, it's not. But I mean, then with the flashbacks, you understand that this has been part of a sort of sadomasochistic kink that they have, which is him using her to stage crime photos and crime scenes.
Isn't it?
Restage, yeah, absolutely. To restage criminal investigations that he's been party to.
Well, it's funny you say that. I when I was a kid, when I would say a kid, I was a teenager. I had a friend at school, and his dad worked at Scotland Yard, and he worked in the forensics department, but he worked at the yard in the building. And the stories he'd tell us about the coppers. I mean, and it's interesting if we talk about the Metropolitan Police, all the shit that's coming out sort of now.
Right.
About, what sharing of WhatsApp messages and pictures of victims and stuff like that, which is kind of what this is doing. I mean, it's interesting that they're doing this in 1970. There was a guy who worked up at the yard who used to video. I mean, this is the days of video, so this is the sort of late 80s, early 90s. He'd video any disaster on TV. Zeebrugge, Heysel, the Bradford Fire, the Marchioness. So he just taped them, and he had his little kind of like this video, 180-minute VHS of death and destruction.
Faces of Death style.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, But it's interesting is that I heard that. So I heard that in the late 80s. And there was another friend of this guy who was an undercover copper. We went to visit him when we were teenagers. He worked with him. And this guy was undercover. He was friends with, bizarrely used to ride motorbikes with Paul Kossoff from Free.
And the plot thickens.
And he lived Lady Hamilton's house, of Lord Nelson, up in that part of London. Obviously, several hundred years after Lady Hamilton lived there. But this guy was undercover, and it's a very sad story. The whole thing, his life kind of went out of control. You look at the stuff about the Psychops scandal in the last few years as well, and you think, well, this, I'm not saying this guy was involved in that, but it's not a stretch to say that was what was going on. So I kind of say this kind of touched a sort of a few buttons in the back of my head that I kind of was aware of when I was younger. That maybe other people were not at the time, but then now, fast forward 25, 30 years, it's pretty much sort of out in the open,
Absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the things that the film suggests is this is almost like an inevitable part of power, and violence.
Well, I think it's specifically Italian, because I think what we're talking about is the difference between British culture and Italian culture. And you know this because you're there. Is that, the Italian culture is absolutely aware of the kind of absolutism of power, whether that's the Catholic Church, whether that's Mussolini, whether that's Devo, whether that's kind of Berlusconi, any of these kind of people. Whereas in Britain, we're a servile culture. We're subjects. And there is deference to authority. Whether that's deference to the Tory party, whether that's deference to people in, the royal family. And that subject thing goes very, very deep. So you look at this culture was kind of asking those questions 40 years ago, nearly 50 years ago. And in fact, he was saying it much earlier than that, because that whole period after the World War II, it's written through it like rock. Whereas in Britain, we kind of like, there's that whole thing, isn't there, that Orson Welles said that the British imagination is a kind of Arcadian fantasy. And if you go into the House of Lords, there's a place, I don't know if you've ever been there, there's the robing room, robe up the Queen before she go into the state opening of Parliament. And on the frieze around the walls it's a story of Christ, then it's the story of King Arthur. And it's like fairy stories. Right. It's a Midsummer Night's Dream. It's that is the British thing. It's an inability, and it's not true of everybody, but there's the strong strand that always kind of snaps back into place is fantasy. The good king and the good institutions and the good knight and all these kinds of things. And the Italians don't have that.
Yeah, absolutely. This level, the laughing policeman, the Dixon of Dock Green, that even today we have sort of, even in the 80s and 90s, the Bill, a real sense that the British copper with his sort of helmet and everything is to be trusted. And, recent events have proven that to be a romantic illusion.
Well, the line of duty, we're the guys rooting out corruption.
The answer to the cops is more cops.
Yeah.
To just put it in that sort of Italian context, which I think you're absolutely right to say this is very specifically Italian, and it's very specifically Italian in the 60s and 70s film when all the politics were really on the surface. The text, there was no subtext. It was text. Elio Petri is Elio Petri's member of the Communist Party until Hungary. Gian Maria Vonte is member of the Communist Party for pretty much his entire career, and he even stands in what the post-Stalin, post-Communist Party left. He stands in various elections. So they're both very committed. That commitment has to be seen also in the context of the fascist past. So Volonte's father was actually a sort of a fairly high-up administrator in the fascist government, and went to jail, was condemned for the death during the German occupation of Italy, went to jail for several years. He was condemned to something like 30, I think, and he served 8. So that's also feeding into these ideas of how power works, because after the Second World War, it wasn't like all the policemen were kicked out and they hired a bunch of new policemen. The policemen who worked under Mussolini were 90% the same policemen who worked at post-Mussolini. And the same thing for local government officials and, lawyers and all the rest of it. There wasn't a denazification process that there was in Germany, as incomplete as that might have been in Germany, but there still was some sort of process involved. Instead, the fascists pretty much stayed in situ. They just tore up their cards and, started singing the praise of the partisans. A friend of mine actually went to a dinner quite recently, and they did the thing of sort of, it was quite a posh house, and they said, go to the bathroom, and they were given directions, and they went up and they went through the wrong door, and they literally went into a room and there were like torches burning and fascist memorabilia displayed. And it was like, oh no, So this is something that hasn't just cast a shadow, it's present today. And the Prime Minister of Italy at this moment, Giorgia Meloni, is a fascist. She comes from a historically fascist party. So yeah, this film is very relevant to the times and very much part of an analysis of that sort of corruption.
Well, it's like that line from our Claudius, isn't it? That all of the poisons that lurk in the mud.
Precisely. And actually, I mean, I say the word corruption, but in a way, it's not really corruption. It's the way it works. It's
that whole thing of familial capitalism. It's the kind of the way that capitalism is constructed in Italy, or historically was. After the war, it's very kind of insiderish, clientelistic. It's kind of corporatist in all of those ways, and in every sort of sense. It's yeah. I mean, I did when I did my MA in politics. I'd still teach politics. At degree level, we did that. We did a kind of thing, a comparison of European social models, how that's played out as one module, which was fascinating. Obviously, the difference between Germany and obviously we looked at Japan as well, but we looked at particularly at Germany, looked at France and Italy, and that kind of runs deep. I mean, the idea that it's like in Italian football, isn't it? You've got like how closely aligned the Agnellis were to Juventus for so long. I know that they've come in and bought it, but De Laurentiis buying, Napoli now, it's like it's the same names.
Absolutely.
That just get recycled. It's like and that that's hugely important. I mean, it's like who's the recent Prime Minister, the one that had to leave, who they brought in, the one who used to be, who had the interim government before.
Draghi.
Yeah. Draghi. Again, it's like it comes from the face from the past. It comes back and sort of like they made him stay. He wanted to leave, didn't he?
Absolutely. And coming back to the film, I think that the way that Italian power is sort of expressed, and it just in the film, it's like this guy can't have killed someone, and if they did, it's kind of an inconvenience. It's not really a crime. And the use of the honorific, the use of dottore, and the amount of respect he's given, and the way he expresses that power. There's some scenes where he is sort of walking through. I mean, you've referred to some films already. I'll add another one to the mix. There's something of Lee Marvin's March from Point Blank in the way Volonté sort of commands the movement of the camera and the scene, and just like walks through a police station, and he's slapping people's faces and tickling them under the chin, and it's utterly his power is sort of complete,
And that's got that thing about playing with time and what's the truth and all the rest of it as well, isn't it? I mean, it's I hadn't really thought of Point Blank, but absolutely, yeah. There's a huge amount of influence there. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think it's, and again, when was Point Blank? 67, 68?
Yeah, would have been.
This is 70. But of course, I think it's interesting if we look at modern Italian politics, where the left sit in this, these left-wing radicals, these hairy bastards, as you kind of saying. It's like, that's kind of, in a weird way, the right occupies that space now, as the kind of,
the disruptor.
Yeah, the disruptor, exactly. So it's kind of interesting the way that shifted as well. It's, yeah, I mean, and I think you know, how many of those radicals would be on the right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the opposition you see in the film presented by the left is sort of, and this is partly a reflection of the times as well, is the gay husband who the film presents with sort of some sympathy, as in he's the victim of this scheme, but also there's a sort of disdain that the film even has for him. And the same thing with the neighbor, who is a kind of more dangerous witness and has a sort of a bit of an afro and is a bit has I don't know, the pop singer sort of look to him. And
it's implied that he's been having an affair with the wife as well, and that he's a more virile lover. All that stuff about, you know, you're a baby, which is the thing about fascism. You know, the thing is you can't make decisions, that you are kind of infantilized in this kind of power structure, and that this radical is somehow, you know, he's a swinging dick, isn't he? He's like, and I do think it's interesting in the film where he's in, you said, the white suit and the kind of cravat, where he looks not more than faintly ridiculous, but where you wonder, is that true? Is he kind of like creating this kind of story in his mind? Because she is such a kind of like, she's not a character, is she? She's a kind of idea, or a kind of, if we're talking about, it's the Madonna whore kind of thing. So there's, I think, the patriarchy and the kind of misogyny of the film is so woven into the kind of fabric of the piece. I mean, she's literally, apart from the cleaning woman, I think she's the only woman with any lines in the film, isn't she?
Yeah, I think so.
So you know, Monty's Cats has got basically a servant. You come at one point, you think, is that his wife? And then you realize actually she's not.
Yeah.
So there's two women in the film that occupy. There's a domestic and a woman he goes to. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the fact that she appears only in flashback, really. I mean, following that first 5 minutes, she's only seen in flashback, which means she's only really seen through his memory. So if she's, you know, I mean, it'd be too much of a push to say she's a figment of his imagination, but she's certainly not a reliable sort of autonomous figure. No. She's someone who's out there, projected from his mind, really, even if she did, you know, she did really exist at some point.
Yeah, no, she's totally. Well, I think you're right. There's no one's autonomous. There's kind of no one's autonomous in the film. It's all so subjectively kind of filtered through his eyes and through his perception and his notion of reality. That, and the other film that's it's like is Clockwork Orange. If you think of that really kind of, I mean, and obviously the difference is because obviously one's in English, the nuances of humor and everything else, but that kind of, you know, institutional kind of like power structure, you know, dehumanization, all the elements that are there, but also just, I think, in terms of tone, in terms of like the extremity of it, the kind of madness of it, the fact that it's all filtered through Alex's eyes in, you know, Clockwork Orange. And what's Clockwork Orange, 71? So this is all happening, this is kind of happening kind of at the same time. So yeah, I think that there's definitely there's a thing in the ether that he's tapping into, that Kubrick was tapping into as well, which is, you know, authority, freedom, power. You know, I mean, how many women are there in Clockwork Orange? It's probably
the mum, and then everybody else is sort of either a rape victim or or the model who turns up to test him. Yeah. Or the victim who's like the sort of artist, the sort of relatively older woman. Yeah. And interestingly, Ennio Morricone, Kubrick wanted Ennio Morricone to do Clockwork Orange, the music, and as a sort of courtesy, he phoned up Leone and said, you know, could I borrow your composer? And Leone said, no, I've got plans for him. And Morricone, that's like one of his biggest regrets, and one of the things he was furious with Leone about was like, I really wanted to work with Kubrick, but and interestingly, when Kubrick saw this film, he is on record loving the score. He thinks the score is amazing, and I think it's one of Leone's most striking scores. It's just, he just manages to make these such unusual choices, and yet you couldn't imagine the film without it.
But you can't imagine Kubrick not liking this film. This is the thing. Even though it's nothing like, in terms of technique and composition, anything like that, it's nothing like a Kubrick film. It's far more freewheeling and loose than that. But in terms of the tone of it, absolutely. I mean, it's just, that's what I'm saying about Clockwork Orange. I didn't actually know that story, but that doesn't surprise me. You can see a huge amount of connective tissue there. And also, I think it's interesting, if you look at Kubrick as well, how much of a kind of a sponge for international cinema he was, and how his whole thing was to kind of bring in all of those different disparate elements and kind of put it into a vaguely commercial format. I mean, I always think of him as a great commercial artist, and as an artist as well, because he is absolutely that. But his films are far more kind of palatable than things. But then we know so many people can't deal with Kubrick's movies because they're so kind of anti-structure or whatever buzzword they kind of apply to it. Whereas what he's really pulling on, it's like that thing where he talks about he was obsessed with Kozlowski's Ten Commandments, wasn't he? Towards the end of his life, before he was doing Eyes Wide Shut, that he couldn't. How can he make 10 of these in a year? It's like, yeah, how much he loved it, and he would watch it in what were those ones? Were they in Czech? Those I can't remember. I think he was Polish, wasn't he? I think he's Polish. Yeah. So he watched whatever one it was. He and Jan Harlan, they screened, I think it was a short film about killing, the one that they turned into a feature, and they just watched it without subtitles, without dubbing, just to kind of be able to just absorb the film on that level. I just think it's very interesting. Completely unconnected to what we're talking about.
No. I definitely. I think that it's important for us to, when we're looking at other national cinemas as well, how it feeds into our own national or international or English language cinema, which is much more, obviously travels much more widely. So someone like Petri, an argument for watching this film isn't like, oh, you need to watch this film because you need to know more about Italian cinema. It's, you need to watch this film because you need to know more about cinema, full stop. It stretches. And I mean, one of the results of that was actually that this film was much more successful internationally than it was in Italy, where it won the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film and was, on a lot of critics' sort of top 10 lists and things like that internationally. But in Italy, it was attacked by the right for showing a sort of subversive view of society, and attacked by the left, and you'll enjoy this, for economically exploiting political issues.
Wow.
So that, if you want to know why the left have been historically weak in Italy, there you have it in a nutshell. they can't take a win. They can't take yes for an answer.
I don't think that's just in Italy. I don't think it's just in Italy. If ever there's a side of an argument to be on, they generally choose the one that will make them look like assholes. It's a sad fact of, if you're on the left, it's sort of yeah. But it's kind of, it doesn't surprise me that it's not. But it's also, it's interesting. It won the Oscar. There's an element. It's not like that film at all, but you can see the same kind of things hitting the kind of the Academy 30 years later when they look at the lives of others or something like that. Totally different film. That film's far more kind of mainstream in its kind of construction, everything else. But that idea of power, and they do love kind of like to look at the kind of, to films that wag a finger at those fascistic power structures outside of the United States. So yeah, that kind of that doesn't surprise me, but also it doesn't surprise me in 1970. I mean, what won Best Picture in that year?
The French Connection.
So yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about Policier, because you do look at some of the stuff in this, some of the shots, some of the setup, some of the texture and tone of the world. And you also think of the French Connection. I did think that when watching the film. So you've got Hollywood that can give that Best Picture in the year that gives this international Best Picture. And I don't think that's not an accident. That's kind of where it was. That's what was going on. And again, you can look at the French Connection as a kind of obviously it's very, very influenced by French cinema. more than kind of Italian cinema, I would say. But there's still that kind of connection. We were talking about the policière and the kind of Italian variants of that. It's still there, bubbling away. And obviously, the great thing in that is obviously he doesn't get he doesn't have a French lead. He has a Mediterranean lead, the villain, doesn't he, rather than a French actor playing the Frenchman.
Yes.
So yeah, there's a kind of, and there's a whole thing about that going through Corsica, isn't there? And in the French Connection, it's kind of got that, still got that kind of. I know the one thing about the French Connection, I never think of it as French.
What is the French Connection? It's Fernando Rey, isn't it? The famous Spanish actor.
Yeah, exactly. So, but they are. I think they're moving things through Corsica, aren't they? I think there's this. It's in that. It's kind of I can't. It's a long time since I've seen it, but it's yeah. There's that strong, but there's an element of that. There's a strong kind of flavour of that kind of runs through that at the time. So the two of them side by side on that year's Academy Awards, that's pretty fitting, I'd say. And that says a lot about Hollywood as well at the time. At internet, we talk about understanding cinema, is that this was the temperature of cinema around this time. And so many interesting and off-kilter films. I mean, when was McCabe and Mrs. Miller? Must be around this time as well. You know, these weird kind of, you know, the 70s becomes more conventional a lot earlier than people think. I think in terms of mainstream US cinema, there is that window of, you know, The Godfather is 71, 72, isn't it? It's like The Conversation's another film where this is there's an element of that kind of lingers in this film as well. I think you can see sort of some of that. There's a lot of the recording of people. There's the listening in. There's the kind of the whole thing of power and.
Which is coming from an Italian film, because it's coming from Blow Up by Antonioni.
Yeah.
So and it's, you know, with Antonioni, it's sort of like a conspiracy that sort of the film then loses. But I mean, at 69, you've got Zed, Costa Gavras's amazing sort of political thriller. Again, with this idea of. I think there's this febrile idea that the Nazis, the fascists, they've not gone away. They're still here and they could take over at any point, and any sort of liberal progress could easily be rolled back.
Which is so pertinent to today, which is why when you look at the things that are being discussed, sort of the cultural kind of like touch points in this film, they're absolutely applicable to 2023. It's probably more pertinent in 2023 than, say, 2013.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, in regard to that, I think this would be an interesting way of sort of rounding off our conversation. Let's talk a bit about the conclusion of the film, because the conclusion is probably the part of the film which I think becomes the most experimental, or the most. It certainly was the part of the film that when I first watched it a good few years ago, I rewatched it last week for this conversation. But when that was the bit that I sort of like sat up and went, "Wait a minute, what? Where? How are we?"
Yeah, no, it's kind of goes into sort of he imagines an ending, and then he kind of wakes up, or is he even asleep? He just imagines an ending, and then we're left with an ending that gives us no answers.
Right, exactly. So the sort of dream sequence, as you say, it's not necessarily clear how clear this is a dream, how clear this is a fantasy, is of all the powerful people, all of his colleagues coming to his house, making him eat salt, which is a detail of it feels like some sort of Masonic or ritualistic kind of act.
Purge him or something.
Yeah. It reminds me of sort of the castor oil punishment that the fascists would mete out, which was recorded by Fellini in Amarcord, if you remember, as one of those scenes. And they basically tell him that he isn't guilty of anything. None of the proof will stand up to any sort of examination, and sort of, kiss the ring and sin no more, my son. And then he wakes up, as you say, and the people all turn up to his house, and we don't know what is going to happen. We don't know what happens next. Yeah. So what do you think happens next?
Well, I think the thing before you talked about that, it's kind of almost like a secular confession, isn't it? He's being absolved of his sins. It's got that kind of, even though there's no religious element, obvious religious element, it's all completely weirdly symbolic and it made me think, Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt, all that kind of weird stuff. But it's, I mean, I think it sort of goes into that space. That's where it's a bit like, I think a bit like The Offense as well. That there's this kind of like, what is he, as Sean Connery become a kind of paedophile, by, osmosis or whatever else. There's this weird kind of transference thing. There's this weird kind of breaking down of reality. It remind me a little bit of like the end of Barbarian Sound Studio or something like that. It's like there's this, which is obviously not something to, completely disconnected from what we're talking about either. It's got this whole, is this what he thinks going to happen? Is he going to get what? Doesn't really matter. I think it kind of, and it ends with the Kafka quote, doesn't it?
Right, which of course we were talking about this via social media earlier this week. After, I mean, this is like the reverse Kafka. A man is guilty of a crime, and the bureaucracy don't listen, refuse to punish him.
Well, it's reverse Kafka and reverse Hitchcock.
Right.
A man wrongly accused. And these forces outside are kind of like raining down on you, and how's he going to clear his name and all the rest of it? And it's kind of the opposite of that. But the quote, I can't remember the quote from Kafka.
It's something about you belong to the law and therefore are outside of justice.
Yes. So it's kind of interesting in that. I think the implication is obviously he kind of gets away with it. That would be my implication. Maybe he doesn't get forced to eat salt, but that he would, and that there is. I think what is interesting is that in all these films, and I think this is the big connection, the big difference, obviously, with the US and the Italian cinema, most profoundly, it's and in particular this film, it's not about in The Departed or in Bad Lieutenant. It's all about the individual. This is not really about the individual. It's about the system. It's about the structure. It's about the collective, and those ideas are really strong. So if you want to try and look at the film, I think the film is kind of that. It's about institutions of power. It's like. In a way, his whole kind of like turmoil, I think he's torn, isn't he? That he is a child, that he is a kind of, that he's, if he could be a radical or he could be a criminal. He is a criminal. So if he's a criminal, could he be a subversive? Could he be a gay artist like the husband? Could he be all of these things? So it's his internal turmoil kind of turned into this kind of an operatic kind of movement of music for 2 hours or whatever. And ultimately, the end of it is much like in those things like Pasolini's films. It doesn't really matter. You're not that important, and obviously she's not that important.
Your cogs. You might be a big cog, you might be a small cog, but in the end, you're a cog. And I mean, I think there's a brilliant reversal. We're talking about sort of reverse Hitchcock, reverse Kafka, but there's a superb scene where he is interrogating the husband, and the husband sort of shouts, get this guy out of here. I'm not sure if it's the husband or the other guy. I don't remember. But anyway, the person who's being interrogated sort of knocks on the door and gets the police to let him out of the cell and leaves the inspector in the cell. And it's just like
radical.
Right, exactly. And it's
he's like left at the other side like a little child, kind of like, he can go. Yeah. Well, I think if you think about this, I think one of the only things, there's not the film. I guess the American film that you would say is the most like this in terms of tone would be something like Killing of a Chinese Bookie. And there is no kind of, it's elusive. There's no way you can put anything down. American cinema will do this, and television will do this with criminals, like The Sopranos as well. You can see a kind of element of, there's an element of that. The dream sequence is Tony's journey in that, what the things Tony does. We're left on a complete kind of like, what did happen to him? Whatever else, that's really. So the Italian-American thing is kind of played through the criminal rather than through the figure of authority. But Chinese Bookie is kind of like that. And if you look at stuff like Husbands and things like that, there is this complete willful, I will not say what the moral point of this film is. And that is because I think you're an adult watching this, you can make your own mind up. And that is, I think, kind of one of the. I mean, Chinese Bookie. When have you seen that recently?
Yeah, I've seen that fairly recently. Yeah. The Ben Gazzara, John Cassavetes.
Yeah, I saw Cassavetes season when I was about in my early 20s, and they showed the kind of, it was a cut of it that had never been shown since the Berlin Film Festival when it came out.
Wow.
And I think it's on the Blu-ray now. And I watched the version that's on the Blu-ray when I bought it back a few years ago, and it's different. I mean, it's shorter and but the thing that's striking in both of those films is that there is no kind of concession to wrapping things up in a neat and tidy bow, and yet the film is incredibly moral. The morality kind of there is morality here. These characters may be amoral, you know. In this, the Doctor is, you know, he's completely amoral, but in some respects, it's the moral turmoil. But it's that thing is, it doesn't matter. I think that's the thing, is that it is, your agency is bullshit.
Right. I mean, I think the title is a real indicator of this. The title suggests that you're about to watch an investigation of a citizen above suspicion, but you don't see that investigation depicted. There isn't an investigation of him. He's not a suspect at any point.
Well,
so the film itself has to be the investigation.
Well, it's a self-investigation. I think it's a self-investigation. There's not saying about it being very moral. It's kind of and I think it's interesting that when we talk about the secular, the religious collective of ideas, you know, when we talk about the state, I mean, this is the thing in the background. It's the state, isn't it? This is the thing. It's like absolutely. I mean, this in Italy goes all the way back to, you know, we talk about Machiavelli. We're talking about everything in their kind of the political culture and the political understanding of everything. I think the thing with he keeps saying that you are a citizen, you know, and we talk about we're defending democracy. So these are very archetypal and primal ideas. It's not that you are you're a good man, or you are a Catholic, or you are a husband, or you're a citizen. And the citizen has kind of connections to the state. The citizen has duties and rights and all the rest of it. So it's this social contractual kind of thing that's going on. It's very much, it's a secular sacrament. It's a secular kind of deal, isn't it? That's my reading of it. That's because that's my, you know, that's what I bring to the table with it. But I think he makes a point lots of times, doesn't he, about that you are a citizen.
Yeah, absolutely. That's his role as head of the political department. He gives a speech on his first day as the head of the political department, which is a political speech, which is all about, you know, how we've got to combat subversion and we've got to protect society. Another very kind of minor point, well, not minor, but I think it runs all the way through the film. He's got a coffee machine outside his office, which he keeps coming out and going, get that moved, I don't want that there anymore. And it's like, and it sort of shows a certain weird limit to power as well, that you can do all this, get away with murder, but try moving that coffee machine. It's
also like a kind of imposition of modernity, isn't it? Because there's no kind of like, there's no kind of like, there's nothing modern. These people don't really watch the TV, as far as I can see. They don't go to the movies. They go to the beach. So it looks a bit like Death in Venice, that sequence, doesn't it? That where he's sitting.
But I think modernity is definitely coming in, because you have that amazing scene where he goes into the archives, and the archives are just like a warehouse of paper
being
files.
computerized.
Exactly. And I think that's the coffee machine. I think that's the
yeah.
You know, how important coffee is to Italian culture, of going to the bar and having a coffee, and now you've got this like offensive little machine outside his office.
Yes, no, you're right. I think that the connection to the computing and the filing is, I hadn't made that connection, but I think that's right. I think there's a very clear thing that something is changing as well. I mean, obviously as well, this is made at the fag end of like that period of the 60s. What's it called?
Post 68, isn't it? And
but it's during that period of 60s, and in the 70s, politics would be very defined by the left, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you're entering into the Anni di Piombo, the years of lead, where there was left-wing terrorism, and you've got, I mean, this guy, as much as Kafka, and as much as there's a sort of science fiction, fantastic element to it, one of the accusations of the right was that this guy was actually based on a real police inspector who was considered to be potentially involved with the promotion of far-right groups. So there is a sort of like this isn't some sort of wild fantasy. This is kind of documentary, a little bit like Children of Men seems to us now, where it's like,
Well,
this isn't wild.
well, the thing is, the one thing I don't, when I watch this, is I don't think that it's wild fantasy.
Right.
It's told in a heightened style, and it's done in a kind of, it's got this kind of like slightly kind of manic kind of tension that runs through it. But that's a heightened sort of subjective dramatic device, isn't it? I think if you look at the reality of like policing and the security forces and all the rest, and internal, surveillance, all this sort of stuff, the kind of the sort of the police and the state. Like we talked about spy cops, didn't we, think earlier on? But all that, the kind of infiltration of groups, the kind of setting up of groups, all that kind of subversion from within the kind of radical movement as well. That's all that's what they do.
Yeah.
They've done since time immemorial. So we know that. And it's not, I don't think it's not a fantasy. I think it's a kind of, it's an artistic impression of something that's very real. I think that's the thing about it. It's very real. The kind of, the misogyny, the patriarchy of it is very real. They're just all men of a certain age, in rooms. I mean, it could be the Conservative Party of 1972, under Edward Heath. It looks like James Callaghan's cabinet.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the 1970s, it's a weird thing. It's kind of interesting actually thinking about that. When you look, there was some stuff about Thatcher that was on recently. It was a documentary about her cabinet or her cabinets. And the thing that was really interesting, if you watch them in 1970, 80, compared to the politicians of the 1970s, her cabinet looks very young. Heseltine, Kenneth Clark, these were guys in their 40s at this point and 50s, and they don't look as kind of shagged out as the kind of the post-war generation of politicians.
Right.
Cameron was in the war. These people have been there for years. And they were all kind of like exhausted. And there were the ones that were like that, the Wets, people, the Willie Whitelaws and all that in that cabinet were of that generation.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of there's a generational shift as well that's kind of coming over the horizon, and that you can see it in those radical figures. And is she a kind of embodiment of some kind of newly emergent feminist ideal? That the left are on the horizon. There's a gay guy that's on the horizon. There's kind of these groups are kind of like, they're marginalized, but they're there, and they're much more vividly drawn than other people. They don't dress in black and white. They're not doing these things. They kind of jump across these boundaries and borders. So yeah. And then maybe that in the way that the society is outside of the state. That's the other thing as well. That the state is this great kind of, it makes everything routine. The routinizer, it becomes this kind of thing. It's like, I think it's interesting in the beginning, they're in black sheets, aren't they?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that room is really interesting. I think that apartment is really interesting. It's sort of like such a psychologically cluttered. It's got all these things you're talking about, and also
and real.
Yeah, and it looks like it really contrasts with his own home and with and he's got books and records and things lying around.
I hate apartments in modern films and television because they never look like where anyone lives. They're just these are horribly kind of precise and they look like shit.
Yeah.
I've been in places like this. I've been in people's apartments. I've been in their lofts. I've been in there kind of, but there's a piano in the hallway and a bike and a kind of like, that's what I always love in Train Spotting when he gets up in the morning and there's the bike in the hallway when he goes after he's been back to Diane's house. I think that's one of the best uses of a house I've ever seen in a film. But this is also great in that way as well. She's got lots of books around as well, so that's always.
Yeah, and her books are literally jolly. She's got loads of crime novels, so it's like, she's so much could be just the cluttered inside of his own brain. That apartment, and what would you if somebody sort of goes off and watches this, and we've mentioned a lot of films. What is there another Italian film that you might want to point people towards? having watched this?
That's interesting. That's an interesting. I think The Consequences of Love is a good one. I think any of that. I think that El Divo, even The Great Beauty as well. I think there's a kind of like an element to all of them that's similar. Because I think Sorrentino is a sort of like, he's a miner of Italian culture in the sort of way, and I think he gets that in a. I mean, no, don't watch his English language stuff or some other things, but those ones I think are particularly special of modern films. I think if you go back, I mean, I think Ossessione.
Absolutely, Visconti.
That version, I still think that's the best version of The Postman Always Rings. Only rings twice. That's that is great. So think of that. Then I mean, there's the obvious ones, and then there's like The Leopard and stuff like that. If you're talking about power, maybe even Rocco and his brothers as well.
Yes, and then The Conformist, the Bertolucci.
Well, actually, The Conformist is the other film that I was thinking of when I was watching this as well. Is that that must be it's roughly the same time, year before, isn't it? Something like that.
Yeah. Let me check. It's 1970.
So it's roughly the same time. So The Conformist is you're right. It's probably, if you want to pick one film to kind of pair it with, it'd probably be that, because you've got someone from the other side dealing with all of these issues in a very different way. And in a way, it's not a surprise that travels as well, because it's an individual focused film. He's an individual. His character is very. I think that's kind of that plays well in the US and Britain. That kind of.
Bertolucci's so visually sumptuous as well that when he looks at corruption, he just makes the most beautiful camera movements, and the autumn leaves and the misty forest, and to some degree that almost transcends the fact that you're watching a political assassination in the misty forest, or you're looking at the heartlessness of I think
Sorrentino does a bit of that as well, isn't he? Obviously, and he's bringing in the Scorsese and Ferrara kind of influences as well, but I think there's an element of that there. I'd say those are the ones that kind of really sort of bring out for me. If you fancy watching Salo, then you can if you want.
That is going to be a future episode. James Wood has chosen that immediately with no hesitation, and I was like, "Oh God, do I have to watch it again?"
I think I've only ever watched it once.
This is going to be my.
I did watch it at the cinema.
Oh my God,
I watched it on a double bill. I watched it not an official double bill. I saw that, and then I went to see Requiem for a Dream. That's when I saw it.
That's an easy Saturday night if you.
It's a Saturday night.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, well, that was when Requiem for a Dream came out, so that's how long ago I saw it. I think I saw Salo at the Prince Charles. I'm pretty sure it was that, and then I went round to the Curzon Soho and watched Requiem for a Dream.
And then you just went home, went straight to bed without talking to anybody, because you're just like, I can't deal with people.
Yeah, I went to church.
Brilliant. Oh, listen, James, thanks so much for coming on and talking about Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion. It's a brilliant film. It was a real pleasure to sort of revisit it with you.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure. It was great to watch it again. It's great to talk about stuff that doesn't involve spandex and superpowers and.
Il popolo è minorenni. La città è malata, ad altri spetta il compito di curare e di educare. A noi il dovere di reprimere. La repressione è il nostro vaccino. Repressione è civiltà.
Arrivederci ragazzi. Ci vediamo in un prossimo film.
Lo speriamo.